As someone just pointed out to me, the centrality of the cross in proclamation is so important that we put it in the post-lunch slot while you're digesting steak and chips. So we'll do our best. I hope you didn't overindulge. So we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapters 1 to 3. So it'll be very helpful to turn to those chapters because everything that I say, I'll be seeking to effectively to expound what Paul is saying in those chapters regarding the preaching of the cross. Now, there is a handout that's online. If you can't access that, there are a few paper copies as well, which Jason is kindly going to hand around. So if you just put your hand up if you don't have access to the online system, and Jason will give you a copy. Thanks very much for that, Jason. So we're going to begin our study of the centrality of the cross in preaching by looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 17. And in 1 Corinthians 1 verse 17, the Apostle Paul states that Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not in wisdom of word, lest the cross of Christ be rendered ineffective, or as it's sometimes translated, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. And what Paul's doing in that verse is he's clarifying the nature of his commission to preach the gospel with a double negation which implicitly critiques the way the Corinthians were evaluating his ministry. So he says to them that he was not sent to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and his preaching of the gospel was not in wisdom of word, hence the double negation. And to this second denial, Paul adds a reason. To preach in wisdom of word would be to make the cross of Christ ineffective. It would be to empty the cross of Christ of its power. And now the Apostle Paul understands the preaching of the gospel to be the means by which God's design in the cross is brought to fruition in the world. That's clear, isn't it? If he was sent to preach the gospel, and it's possible through the preaching of the gospel for the cross to be emptied of its power, clearly the preaching of the gospel is the means that God has ordained for the cross to be powerfully effective in the world and in people's lives. But Paul also considers it possible to frustrate God's design if the manner of communication is not consistent with the message being communicated. Paul was not sent to preach the gospel in what he calls wisdom of word. Now, 1 Corinthians chapters 1 to 3 is a very well-known passage in which the wisdom of God on the one side and the wisdom of the world are contrasted, with the cross of Christ standing as the great divide that separates the two from one another. And framing the passage on either side of this extended contrast in those first 3 chapters is a critique of the party rivalries that were plaguing the church in Corinth. So each of the Corinthians, as I'm sure you know, were professing allegiance to a different leader. They were saying, as Paul puts it in chapter 1, verse 12, I am of Paul. And someone else is saying, I'm of Apollos. And then someone else, I'm of Cephas. And someone else, I'm of Christ. And this folly of reimagining their leaders as little Christs horrifies Paul. And so he sarcastically asks them, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized into the name of Paul? That's chapter 1, verse 13. And he then applies the corrective of the cross to this problem throughout chapters 1 to 3, before, at the end of chapter 3, calling for an end to boasting in mere people and for a broadening of their horizons to encompass all that they've been freely gifted in Christ. So in short, in these chapters, Paul's lifting up the wisdom of the cross to critique the worldly wisdom by which they were living. But more specifically, and this is what I want us to look at, he lifts up the wisdom of the cross to defend the particular manner of preaching to which he's committed, in order that they would evaluate his ministry and that of these other leaders by God's wisdom and not the world's. So in this paper, I'm going to seek to identify the form of preaching that is critiqued by the cross and the form of preaching that is necessitated by the cross. In other words, I'm going to seek to clarify what Paul means by the phrase wisdom of word, literally wisdom of word, in chapter 1, verse 17, although most of our translations will say something like eloquent words of wisdom. So we're going to seek to identify the preaching that aligns with God's cross-shaped wisdom in contrast to that word of wisdom. Now, in addition to chapter 1, verse 17, Paul makes three further related statements in which he also repudiates a particular form of preaching. And I've put them all down there together. So chapter 1, verses 17 to 18, the first statement, Christ sent me to preach the gospel not in wisdom of word, lest the cross of Christ be rendered ineffective. And then chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, I came to Corinth, not according to superiority of word or wisdom, proclaiming to you the wisdom of God, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. So that's number 2. Number 3, chapter 2, verses 4 to 5. And my word and my proclamation in Corinth were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in the proof of the Spirit and power, in order that your faith might not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And then number 4, in chapter 2, verses 12 to 13, the things freely given to us by God, which we speak, not in words taught of human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, explaining spiritual things with spiritual words. Those 4 phrases, those 4 denials are obviously all related. They all contain some combination of the extremely common Greek words sophia, wisdom, and logos, word. As I say, 2 very common words with very wide semantic ranges, which makes the interpretation of the first phrase, wisdom of word, particularly difficult. Word qualifies the type of wisdom to which Paul is referring. It's a word type of wisdom. But then we're heavily reliant upon the 3 next phrases and the broader context to clarify this phenomenon that opposes the cross and which Paul therefore opposes. Within the broad context, Paul speaks repeatedly of the wisdom displayed by the world, chapter 1, verse 20, and chapter 3, verse 19. Or this age, again, chapter 1, verse 20, chapter 2, verse 6, verse 8, chapter 3, verse 18. Or simply, people or men, chapter 125, 2, verse 5, 3, verse 3, 3, verse 4, and 3, verse 21. So this wisdom of word, then, is clearly a manifestation of the world's wisdom. It's clearly the wisdom of men. And it represents a problem that's endemic to humanity, because Paul relates it to this world in its rebellion against God, not simply to a practice that was happening in first century Corinth. It's also clearly a verbal form of wisdom, as the shift to the plural words in phrases 3 and 4 confirms. So, what we can say at this stage is that what Paul will not countenance in his gospel preaching is a type of speech that manifests the world's wisdom rather than God's. And so for the sake of argument, as we think about this, I'm going to call it worldly wise speech. Paul will not countenance preaching with worldly wise speech. Now, the other thing to notice is that as well as combining the words sophia and logos, all 4 phrases function to qualify the manner in which Paul publicly spoke God's word. Notice that it was Paul's gospel preaching that was not in wisdom of word. Chapter 1, verse 17. It is when Paul came to Corinth proclaiming the mystery of God that he did so not in superiority of word or wisdom. Paul's word and proclamation in Corinth were not in persuasive words of wisdom, chapter 2, verse 4. And then finally, Paul and his fellow gospel ministers speak the things freely given by God, not in words taught of human wisdom. So all these phrases qualify the manner in which Paul did not speak, did not preach. And I think that's an important observation because it suggests that the wisdom Paul opposed was not obviously or overtly antithetical to the gospel in theological content, because he repeatedly disavows a particular manner of preaching rather than message. And thereby he implies that it's theoretically possible to preach the gospel, this mystery of God, in this wisdom of word manner. However, as we'll see, and this is the key point, to preach the gospel message in a manner that's antithetical to the gospel is to distort the gospel message. That is what Paul is arguing for. The medium can betray the message. Now, the problem with worldly wise speech, then, is not that it explicitly teaches religious or philosophical ideas that were at variance with the gospel, although clearly Paul rejected all such alternative gospels, and Galatians chapter 1 is the most obvious case in point. Rather, it was that the world's wisdom was in some way embodied within the form of speaking, such that it was inseparable from it. The medium communicated its own message, one which was inherently at odds with the gospel. Later on in his argument, interestingly, Paul proceeds to speak of himself and his fellow apostles as themselves an exhibit, a cross-shaped spectacle, the Greek word theatron, from which we get theatre. And in this case, it did mean theatre, a spectacle seen at the theatre. But Paul and his fellow apostles had themselves become such an exhibit. They had themselves become a play or a spectacle seen at the theatre. So Paul's happy to speak of what he is and what he's doing in his preaching in such language. So his objection is not that worldly wise preaching was a form of public theatre, performance-orientated rather than truth-orientated in nature. His objection is to the truth being performed in the act of preaching. According to Paul, it is possible to apparently be proclaiming the wisdom of God, to be proclaiming the cross of Christ, but all the while to be performing the wisdom of the world, and therefore what is heard and believed is the wisdom of the world. Now, returning to the four phrases in question, and we're going to look at phrases numbers 2 to 4, which clarify the meaning of the very opaque phrase number 1, wisdom of word. Paul relabels this worldly wise speech to draw attention successively to its value, its power, and its source. Its value, its power, and its source. So Paul says that he refused to speak, chapter 2, verse 1, according to superiority of wisdom or word. That's a question of value. Or with persuasive words of wisdom, chapter 2, verse 4, that's a question of power. Or in words taught by human wisdom, chapter 2, verse 13, that's a question of source. So each expression is deliberately chosen to encourage us to evaluate the worldly wise speech within the broader context of these two opposing wisdoms in which the phrases are situated. This context where the wisdom of the world is rendered foolish by the cross of Christ. So let's briefly consider each expression in turn. First, superiority of wisdom or word implies a hierarchy of values and the speaker's ability to, or attempt to operate at the pinnacle of that value system. Now, to understand this issue of hierarchy and seeking superiority of wisdom or word, three things need to be observed from the context. First, Paul actually presents us with three value-laden polarities: wisdom, versus folly, power versus weakness, and the noble versus the ignoble, or the highborn versus the lowborn. And these three polarities intermingle and mutually interpret one another in this passage. And for the first time, they appear together in chapter 1, verses 26 to 28, where Paul notes that when you Corinthian believers were called by God, not many of you were wise according to the flesh, not many powerful, not many of noble birth. God, however, has deliberately chosen the foolish, the weak, and the ignoble of this world so as to shame the wise and the powerful. Now, it's that third polarity which contrasts highborn with lowborn that explicitly describes a hierarchy of status. It's a hierarchy of status and honor that was deeply embedded within the first century Greco-Roman world. You either had honor or you did not have it. You either were highborn or you were not. But, as John Barclay notes, quote, wisdom, power, and honor are overlapping characteristics that reach their acme among the elite. In other words, they all exist on a scale of value. They all denote what is excellent, what is superior, what is praiseworthy. They all epitomize the values of culture and civilization to which people aspired and which were celebrated within first century rhetoric and oratory. Therefore, within this context, the word superiority in the phrase superiority of wisdom or word suggests a form of speech that is cultured, sophisticated, and impressive. Second, as has often been noted, crucifixion as a form of death was designed to maximize the humiliation and the degradation of the victim. So in crucifixion, the victim was put on public display. The spectacle was all important in a form, the form was all important, that graphically celebrated the victim's utter weakness, folly, and worthlessness. In other words, the opposites of what civilization truly valued. The crucified victim was a despicable nobody. The word that Paul uses in chapter 1, verse 28, the nobodies, the nothings of the world. But if the world, and this is key, in all its sophisticated wisdom and civilized values, crucified the Lord of glory, Jesus Christ, treating the Lord of glory as the one who had no honor, how utterly bankrupt the world's whole system of wisdom and value must be. Third, therefore, at the cross, God does not invert the world's value system, he destroys it. So notice that Paul says, and the language is very strong in terms of God's agency, God destroys the wisdom of the wise. He nullifies the understanding of those in the know and brings to nothing the things that are. Chapter 1, verse 19, chapter 1, verse 29. Now, as Paul explains this, interestingly, he juxtaposes terms taken from two of the different polarities. So in the evaluation of the perishing, the word of the cross is folly. In the eyes of believers, it is the power of God, where we might have expected wisdom of God. Paul preached in such a way as to ensure that the Corinthians' faith was not in the wisdom of men. This is chapter 2, verses 4 to 5. But in the power of God, not the wisdom of God. So it's not simply, and I think this is why Paul does this, it's not simply that where the world sees folly, the believer perceives wisdom. That might imply that both groups are sitting and making their value judgments using the same currency, but coming to a different calculation on the basis of it. In other words, believers have done their sums right, unbelievers have done their sums wrong, but they're using the same currency in making their evaluation. But what Paul says is much, much more radical. It's in the folly that the world so derides that the believer perceives wisdom. because it's in the folly that God's wisdom is most dramatically displayed. In other words, in the cross of Christ, God wipes out one currency of evaluation and introduces another. He destroys the wisdom of the wise. And Paul really celebrates this paradox. So as he puts it in chapter 1, verse 25, the foolish thing of God, literally the foolish thing of God, namely the cross, is wiser than people, and the weak thing of God, again, namely the cross, is stronger than people. So the one saving act of God is simultaneously extraordinarily foolish and extraordinarily powerful. Now, this context helps us to understand Paul's disavowal of superior speech in chapter 2, verse 1. His objection is not that in preaching, in superiority of wisdom or word, that one overreaches in being too flashy or flamboyant or too intellectual and sophisticated. The problem is not where the preacher is operating on a scale of rhetorical skill and sophistication. The problem is that the preacher is operating by such a scale at all. Paul is objecting to a form of virtue and status signaling that says, look how wise I am, look how powerful I am, look how clever I am. In other words, he's objecting to the way in which the preacher projects himself in such a way as to gain honor and reputation according to these values that the world so loves. One of the characters in a dialogue on oratory, a late first century discussion of rhetoric and oratory by Tacitus, says that, quote, just as it was considered great and glorious to have the reputation of being a good speaker, so on the other hand, it was accounted discreditable to be inarticulate and incapable of utterance. Now, such a statement, and there are so many like it from the first century ancient world, reflects a cultural context within which rhetoric was seen to play a key role in upholding and celebrating the treasured values of civilization. Rhetoric was key in doing that. And as such, it was far from neutral, since the criteria by which the world judges what is honorable and impressive have been destroyed by the cross. Now, as already noted, on each occasion that Paul rejects the worldly wise manner of speaking, he does so as a qualification of the gospel message that he preaches. So that suggests that the problem with the manner is implicit in the character of the message. It is in proclaiming the mystery of God, chapter 2, verse 1, that Paul rejects superiority of speech or wisdom. Now, the concept of mystery implies the revelation by God of what is inaccessible to human wisdom, what has been hidden from human wisdom, and what is now revealed through the preaching of the gospel. Preaching in superiority of word or wisdom, by drawing attention to either the skill or insight of the preacher, obscures the hidden wisdom of God behind a layer of worldly grime, as it were. Impressive it may be, but it obscures what is truly wonderful. Therefore, when Paul says that by contrast he resolved to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified, chapter 2, verse 2, he's not saying, as this has sometimes been taken, that he had nothing else to talk about in Corinth other than the cross, as if this was the only thing he had to speak about. In chapter 15, he will make it plain that as he did wherever he went, and as all the apostles did, he preached the resurrection from the dead. Rather, what Paul means is that he mentally resolved to have nothing to do with the virtue and status signaling that was endemic to a world so radically alienated from God. Paul refused to play the posturing game. If the message of the gospel destroys the wisdom on which such posturing is based, the use of it in preaching makes the cross of Christ ineffective. The message will not be heard. So that's Paul's first elaboration on worldly wise speech, its value. Secondly, his second elaboration in chapter 2, verse 4, is expressed in terms of this speech's persuasive power. My message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in a demonstration of the Spirit and power, in order that your faith might not be in the wisdom of might not be in the wisdom of people, but in the power of God. Chapter 2, verses 4 to 5. Now, again, this is obviously a very brief description of this rhetoric Paul opposes, but there are two hints as to its nature. The first hint is the adjective persuasive, pathos, which is found nowhere else in extant Greek. However, the verbal form patho, I persuade, was used by rhetoricians to describe a speaker's captivating persuasive power. And within that context of captivating rhetoric, wisdom could be used to describe a speaker's skill or his cleverness. And in this light, it's perhaps significant that Paul shifts from the singular my message and my preaching to the plural persuasive words. Since for a powerful display of eloquence, the choice of particular words and phrases was absolutely key to a speaker's success if he was going to win the audience over with an impressive rhetorical display. Now, supporting the inference that persuasive words of wisdom are words of captivating eloquence and skill is Paul's explanation in chapter 2, verse 5, that such speech directs the audience's faith to the wisdom of people and away from the power of God. So as with the effect of the superior speech in chapter 2, verse 1, the one who embodies the wisdom, namely the worldly wise speaker, receives the honor and the plaudits and consequently a following, as was happening in Corinth. Now, the second hint comes from Paul's use of the word demonstration or proof, apodeixis, which stands in opposition to pathos, not in persuasive words of human wisdom, but in a proof or in a demonstration of the Spirit and power. This was another loaded and key word used in the context of rhetoric. In the context of rhetoric, apodeixis carried a particular Aristotelian sense in which proof involved the movement from agreed premises through syllogistic reasoning to certain inference. In other words, it was a certain form of proof. It's like saying all scripture is God-breathed. Paul's letter to the Corinthians is scripture, and therefore it's God-breathed. It's a syllogism that results in certain demonstration, certain proof. In other words, Paul chooses a word to deliberately ascribe to the Spirit a level of persuasive power and certain proof that lies totally beyond the persuasive skill of the greatest rhetoricians. Now, he's not denying that he himself seeks to persuade his audience. That's obviously important to grasp if we're not going to make what Paul says here contradict his statement in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 11, where he says that knowing the fear of God, we persuade people. So it's not that Paul didn't persuade. It's not persuasion per se that Paul has a problem with. The contrast he draws is between the human preacher whose impressive and forceful eloquence serves to win the audience to himself, and the Spirit who, through the power of the gospel, wins the listeners to Christ. One of, I think, the most striking things about Paul's description here is he doesn't actually contrast two different rhetorical methods or techniques or approaches to preaching at his disposal. He contrasts the speaker's powerful, captivating rhetoric with the Spirit's certain conviction. And Paul himself has totally receded into the background. In other words, God's agency, and not the preacher's, is decisive in persuading the audience of the message. But the common denominator between the two forms of persuasion is that the wisdom the listeners become persuaded of is the very same wisdom that they are persuaded by. If I am persuaded by the preacher's winsome and powerful display, then I am persuaded to trust in the wisdom of men, in the wisdom of people. Chapter 2, verse 5. However, if I am persuaded by the Spirit's power, then I come to trust in the power of God. Chapter 2, verse 5. That phrase, spirit and power, in chapter 2, verse 4, is a hendiadys. It expresses a single idea with two words. It's like saying the powerful Spirit. Each word illuminates the other. So what Paul is saying is that in the preaching of the gospel, a power, namely the power of the Spirit, is at work to bring certain conviction. But earlier, Paul has described the word of the cross concerning Christ as the power of God. Chapter 1, verse 18, and chapter 1, verse 24. Now, it's incredibly unlikely, I think, that he's now speaking of a different source of power, as some have suggested, that Paul is now talking about the authenticating role of miracles, for example. Rather, he's speaking of the same reality from two different perspectives. It is the gospel word of the cross, under the agency of the Spirit, that itself carries the power to persuade. Those who are persuaded by this power are won to it, putting their faith not in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God, namely in the crucified Christ, who is the power of God. Paul's aim in his preaching, that his hearers would trust in the power of God and not in the wisdom of men, mirrors his understanding of God's design in the cross. Now, God's design, as we've observed, is to save believers in such a way that the wisdom of the world is destroyed. In saving believers through overpowering the world's wisdom, God ensures that no one would boast before him. Chapter 1, verses 28 to 29. The great aim of the gospel and the great aim of preaching is to bring an end to human boasting and to create an entirely new type of boasting that is in God alone. It's the very purpose of gospel preaching, to bring boasting before God to an end, that all boasting might be in the Lord alone. Therefore, preaching in such a way that feeds human boasting in wisdom, power, and honor, or that celebrates human power and honor, celebrates the very thing that the folly of the cross is designed to destroy. As such, again, it renders the cross of Christ ineffective. It appears so powerful, but ironically, it strips the gospel of its unique power. Its power to save through destroying the wisdom of the world. Now, Paul's fourth and final disavowal of worldly wise speech comes in chapter 2, verse 13. Its similarity to the previous phrases is clear. So we've looked at the value of worldly wise speech, its power, and now its source. Now, I've only given the Greek there for how chapter 2, verse 13 relates to the previous verses, but whether you read Greek or not, it's really obvious the way in which the words actually line up and match with one another. That's the point. Paul is still talking about his manner of preaching. Nevertheless, in chapter 2, verse 6, there is a shift in Paul's argument. Having declared the overthrow of the world's wisdom through the folly of the cross, Paul then turns in chapter 2, verse 6, to give a positive account of wisdom. Instead of the world's wisdom, he, along with the other preachers, speaks God's wisdom. That's chapter 2, verses 6 to 7. And the focus subtly changes. Now Paul speaks not of preaching this wisdom, but of speaking it, rather than proclaiming it, and of speaking it among a particular group of people called the mature. Chapter 2, verse 6. Further, later in the passage, God's wisdom becomes substituted for what Paul calls the deep things of God. Chapter 2, verse 10. And then simply the things of God. chapter 2, verses 11 to 13. Now, each of these changes might imply, as some interpreters think they do imply, that Paul's no longer speaking of the word of the cross. However, this is very unlikely, since he repeatedly emphasizes in chapter 2, just as he has presupposed in chapter 1, that God's wisdom is unknown and inaccessible to human beings. The very idea presupposed in his discussion of the folly of the cross. He also repeats the language of mystery, which he previously used in chapter 2, verse 1 in reference to the gospel proclamation, which he uses again. Paul's talking about the same message. He's talking about the same wisdom, but the scene has changed from the world to the church. Now, when Paul again combines the ideas of the mystery of God and the wisdom of God, as he does here, in Colossians chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, he identifies Christ as the mystery of God, in whom all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are hidden. For Paul, there simply is no wisdom outside of Christ and him crucified. There's no speaking of God's wisdom that is not a speaking of Christ. It's no surprise then that the change of scene brings with it no change of method on Paul's part. He continues to renounce worldly wise speech, since the wisdom of the cross forbids it. But this time, Paul contrasts two sources of teaching. We speak the things of God not in words taught of human wisdom, but in words taught of the Spirit, explaining spiritual things with spiritual words. What Paul speaks are the things freely given by God through his Spirit. How he speaks is not in words taught of human wisdom, but taught of the Spirit. Now again, notice that Paul does not contrast two different rhetorical methodologies at his disposal. He contrasts the words taught in the rhetorical schools of his day with words taught by the Spirit. In other words, his methodology is the Spirit's pedagogy. Now, what this actually means in practice is summarized with the final phrase of verse 13, which succinctly combines the what and the how of his teaching ministry. He speaks the things of God, and this involves explaining spiritual things with spiritual words. Now, the translation I've given there will be very close to your NIV translation if you're using an NIV, and very different to the ESV and CSV if you're using those. That's because I think they're wrong and the NIV is right. But the phrase is open to a number of possible interpretations, but the simplest, I think, is to find the reference to pneumatikos, spirituals, masculine spirituals, and pneumatika, neuter spirituals, in the earlier part of the verse. Pneumatikos refers back to the words taught by the Spirit, and pneumatika to the things freely given by God which Paul speaks. And so to paraphrase, and to bring a very long discussion in the commentaries to a head, Paul explains the things God has freely given through his Spirit, namely the gospel mystery, with words that likewise are the Spirit's. He explains the spiritual things of the gospel with spiritual words that come from the Spirit. So Paul at this point, I think, seems to be claiming for his teaching a verbal inspiration. It's consistent with the way he presents himself elsewhere as being in the mold of the Old Testament prophets. He presents himself simply as a mouthpiece through whom God teaches by his Spirit, who has nothing of himself to contribute. But what is so striking here is that he references verbal inspiration as an explanation of the manner of his teaching. In other words, what he teaches and how he teaches have in effect become indistinguishable. As Lightfoot puts it in his commentary on this verse, words are at once the instruments of carrying on and the means of expressing ideas, so that the words must both lead and follow the thought. Change the words, you change the ideas. Now, very briefly in conclusion, linguists are very familiar with the idea that the language we use to communicate with one another is profoundly enculturated. Our speech doesn't stand outside of culture, it's a product of it, and itself shapes it. Our language has its source within this particular culture, it's laden with the values of this particular culture, and it has power to shape the culture. And Paul clearly understood this dynamic, but he assumes its operation not just at the level of individual human cultures, but at the level of this world age, of which every local culture is an expression. Now, preaching, as Paul presents it in these chapters, is the activity through which God confronts this bankrupt world age with the heavenly wisdom of God, a wisdom hidden from the rulers of this age and only revealed through his Spirit. But the preacher who proclaims this wisdom from another world preaches not only to those who are necessarily enculturated within this world, within this age, but as one who is himself likewise enculturated. We cannot escape the world of which we're a part. As such, the preaching dynamic is inherently a dangerous one, since the very activity designed by God to confront the bankrupt wisdom of this world and to call believers out of this world and to himself risks taking place in an echo chamber in which boasting in human wisdom, power, and glory is perversely amplified rather than silenced. Now, aware of this prevalent danger and deeply concerned not to be a part of it, the preacher who keeps the cross central in his preaching will, I suggest, be marked by three characteristics. And I promise you very quickly in closing, these three I think are, and I'm sure they could be enumerated. He will be careful to ensure that his words function so as to give as clear an explanation as possible of God's word. He will be wary of any words he says that could distort or obscure God's message. The Apostle Paul was concerned to show that the particular words he spoke were derived from the particular message he was given. Because the word of the cross was otherworldly in its origin, value, and power, he had no liberty to speak according to the canons of worldly wise speech. To attempt to speak the Spirit's wisdom as a preacher without being constrained to diligently search out the meaning of the Spirit's words in Scripture is a failure to submit to the wisdom of the cross in preaching. It's not just poor homiletical method. It's a failure to submit to the wisdom of the cross. Secondly, he will be cautious to avoid any form of language or any use of media that shifts the focus away from Christ, either onto himself or others. Now, if the great aim of worldly wise speech is to exalt self, and the great aim of God in preaching is to dethrone self and exalt Christ, so that all boasting might be in the Lord alone, the preacher who keeps the cross central in preaching will be concerned to portray himself in such a way as to communicate that he has no power, wisdom, or status apart from Christ. There are 1,000 ways, and I'm sure you can think of some of them, in which a preacher, by word, or by gesture, or by demeanor, or by the media apparatus that surrounds his ministry. And remember, we live in an age where you can have a media apparatus surrounding your ministry, and the sophists of the first century didn't have that advantage. There are 1,000 ways in which a preacher can present an impressive persona before his hearers, but to do so is to betray the cross and to empty it of its power. And thirdly, he'll be concerned that his preaching confronts the bankrupt values of the world in which his hearers live. One of the benefits of moving from one country to another, and therefore from one culture to another, is that you get to laugh at the rank stupidity of the people all around you in a way that locals can't. And then, when you have lived there long enough, I've now lived here 5 years, and become a bit more enculturated, you begin to struggle to understand why things are done the way they are back in your homeland. The cross cuts across all human culture and declares us all to be utter fools, to be fools in the utter perversity of our criteria of value and worth. The little things count in preaching. The people you reference, the successes you celebrate, the illustrations that you give, the sins that you will and won't name, it all serves to teach the hearers what true wisdom is. And as Paul is at such pains to emphasize in these chapters, it's the wisdom that we're won by which will ultimately be the wisdom that we believe in. So let me exhort you, my brothers and sisters, to keep the cross central in your preaching.
The question was about motive, the use of the word motive not being in the talk, but how does motive factor into what you're talking about?
I personally don't think so. I think this is one of the things that comes through just... I use culture as an illustration of what I think Paul is talking about in terms of this world and this age, which is in the deep grip of values that are anti-God, that are anti-wisdom. I think we get caught up in those values and are often not aware of the extent to which we actually assume them and embrace them, which is why I gave that loving illustration at the end about how strange it was coming here to Australia and just seeing the weirdness of you guys, but then realizing after being here for a while, this is what happens when you go to another culture. You come from outside the culture and see and see deep-seated values and commitments that are strange or even wrong, and then that enables you to see them back in your own culture. So I don't necessarily think it's motive.
The question is again about motive, connecting to Philippians. Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, he clearly believes that they were preaching Christ, and they were preaching Christ out of rivalry, out of selfish ambition. I don't think Paul could have believed that in their preaching they were effectively presenting a different gospel, a different wisdom. So that actually might be a helpful passage to refer to in answer to Simon's question, in as much as I think the motive can be perverse, but you could still actually give a faithful presentation of the gospel. And the motive could be pure, but you could so surround yourself with the paraphernalia of the world's wisdom, power, and glory in the way you go about things, that the message you effectively communicate betrays the gospel. So again, I think that probably does illustrate that I don't think you can pin it to motive.
So persuasion, feature in Acts, looking at the 4 points that Will pulled out, what has that got to do with content and persuasion in connection with manner?
I think my answer is a yes and no to that. I don't think Paul, and this is one of the things I was struck by, Paul doesn't specifically express his manner in opposition to this worldly wise manner. He interposes the Spirit's role. So he's clearly saying it's the agency of God, it's the agency of the Spirit that is key. At the same time elsewhere, especially in 2 Corinthians, he does begin to speak about the way he goes about things. But it seems to be in a way that's consistent with that message. His manner is so as to explain the message clearly, so as to persuade people of the message. So I think it's a both and. The type of persuasion that Paul is opposed to is one that seeks to win the audience over to self. That's the dynamic. It's seeking to win the audience over to, not to the gospel itself, but to self.
So warning signs about reputation overpowering the gospel and the cross.
Yeah, I think one of the warning signs is not going out of your way to deflect attention from yourself when you receive it. So it tends to be the case that those preachers who've become quite successful will gather around them an entourage, bigger congregations, movements. It's been that way down through history. If you're a godly man who is committed to the wisdom of the cross, you will find ways and ask for help to find ways to deflect such attention and adoration that you receive from the world. Those who don't, I think, are in great danger. So you have, you've got the apostles in Acts immediately insisting We're men, not gods. But of course, we love to treat our leaders like, our Christian leaders like little gods, like celebrities. If they themselves are not going out of their way to deflect that at the first notice of it, then they clearly haven't embraced the wisdom of the cross. And I can think of so many examples, but they wouldn't be edifying. So, yeah.
What's the advantage of preaching over just reading the Bible, given what you've said?
So that people would understand. I mean, Paul's great aim, and the reason that he contextualized his gospel preaching was he wanted his audience, wherever that audience was, whether it was in Athens or in Corinth, to understand the message, to comprehend it. So the preacher's great aim is comprehension, is clarity. And that will always involve explaining what Paul says in chapter 2, verse 13, explaining spiritual things with spiritual words. Now, actually, I think that verse, if I've understood it correctly, explaining spiritual things with spiritual words, is a fantastic argument for expository preaching. The spiritual words, the words of the Spirit that we've been given, which explain the gospel, are the words of the Bible. And it's in teaching and explaining those, but contextualized so that people understand them, which means, as Paul says, becoming all things to all men. I've got to get into your shoes if I'm going to help you understand. So I think it's all about comprehension. It's all about understanding.
Okay, so it's a question about Australian culture, but more than that, it's a question about Australian values when it comes to preaching and other things that we're not aware of.
Oh, Lionel, we should sit down over coffee maybe and have a question about that. I always knew that was a risk I could be asked that, having put that in at the end of the talk. One of the things that strikes me, and it's the same when I lived in South Africa, is the extent to which the nation's heroes, it's a bit different in South Africa, the extent to which the nation's heroes are sports people. And I think that reflects a particular view of power and achievement within the culture that is not critiqued, I haven't heard critiqued in pulpits as much as perhaps it could be. So the question of, it's this power, weakness, antithesis. What is strength? What is power? What is success? That seems to be in a particular way pinned onto the sports icons. And I think that says something about the nation's values. Yeah.
Very good. Well, can we thank Will again for his questions?